Chainsaw Massacre.
The Texas Chainsaw Massacre is a 1974 film directed by Tobe Hooper and is starring Marilyn and Gunnar Hansen. Five friends are traveling to rural Texas to visit the grave of a grandfather, but on the way they stop at this what looks like deserted house that has something sinister within. So I was a little late to the party for this movie. I only saw clips of it when I was younger, and I'd seen literally like every slasher ever when I was like 12 years old, except for this franchise. And I didn't actually see the movie in its entirety until college. I thought the movie was alright upon like first watching it. The problem with this movie for me is that movies like Halloween and Nightmare on Elm Street, Child's Play, they have a lot of fun while you're watching it. I mean, they just feel like you could rewatch it over and over again. And with this movie, it feels very hot, it feels very nasty, and I just never have the urge to want to rewatch it. So I sat down again to give this movie a try, and I knew that it's super influential in the genre. There's no doubt. No doubt that this is a huge impact on horror, as it was the very first slasher film put to screen, and some may argue that Psycho or Peeping Tom were some of the first slashers, but this movie laid the basic foundations and principles that we see in more of the modern slashers today. Movies like Halloween are kind of what solidified those certain tropes and cliches that we see all the time in slashers. Like I said, a lot of people do consider this to be one of the first slashers ever. This and Black Christmas actually predate Halloween, which came out in 1978. The problem with this movie was that upon its initial release, it basically got critically obliterated and didn't do too well financially either. It wasn't until it got re-released that it started garnering more of a following and became more of a classic. But movies like Halloween were huge successes, and that's why people remember Halloween being the very first slasher, where it's not the case. It was a huge financial success, and then it even spawned a bunch of holiday knockoff slasher movies like My Bloody Valentine. And Halloween is kind of what is known as starting the entire slasher subgenre. You know, Friday the 13th came out, and then Nightmare on Elm Street, Child's Play, all those movies, Prowler, things like that. Tobe Hooper actually had a clever way of marketing this movie where he misled the audience into thinking that it was based off of actual events. That's just such a good marketing tactic, and I feel like a lot of horror movies kind of rely on some sort of marketing ploy that gets people in the seats. All movies kind of have to do that, but especially with the horror genre, you know, you look back at, Terrifier 3 came out not so long ago, and people were like, oh, there's a huge scene in this movie that's crazy, and the first 10 minutes are insane. You know, things like this build hype around a movie, and I think Tobe Hooper was just one of the first filmmakers to kind of capitalize on that. While the real-life serial killer Ed Gein is what inspired the character of Leatherface, the events and characters in this movie are completely fictional. Tobe Hooper at the time was working as a professor and as a documentary cameraman, so that really explains why this movie feels like it's shot like a documentary and less like a narrative film. There are classic shots, like the iconic shot where it dollies in behind the girl and it's following, basically just on her butt. Most of the shots in this movie, though, were made to look documentary-like and adds to the realism and the marketing ploy of this feeling like it was based on real events. Camera flashes on these corpses and like rotting corpses, and it feels like you were experiencing like a crime scene. The opening shot of this like rotting corpse on this like post with the blazing sun in the background really sets the tone for what we were about to experience the rest of the movie, because you feel nothing but this heat. It's almost like the heat in this movie is a character in itself. The horror stories of the making of this film have become legend in itself, with 31 days, I believe, of filming over the course of this massive heat wave that Texas was experiencing at the time. Cast and crew were passing out or throwing up a lot of times, especially during this dinner scene where they had actual rotting meat and it was making everybody on the set sick. Besides the actual Texas heat, they had huge heat lamps lighting the set, and that just, it can't be fun for anybody. That's why, as an aspiring filmmaker, I watched this movie and I could just feel how miserable the cast and crew must be shooting this. And honestly, it's just a good example of what not to do on set. There were a lot of bad working conditions, notoriously, with this movie. It feels very run-and-gun filmmaking, which later inspired Sam Raimi's The Evil Dead. It's a miracle this movie even finished production and actors didn't just quit. This movie is about a psychopathic family which is supposed to represent the deconstruction of the American nuclear family as they murder these teens that are supposed to represent the progressive hippie movement of the time. This example is just one of many of how Tobe Hooper had blatant social and political commentaries just filling up so many frames of this movie. There are points where the commentaries become almost satirical, especially with certain characters, especially with like the Sawyer family. They could be so funny to watch sometimes. I know it's kind of messed up to say. It's like the acting is just like so crazy and over the top. Speaking of the acting, it's not good. The characters in this movie are just not good. You don't really care about them, and I can't really name any of the characters off the top of my noggin right now, but what makes or breaks this movie is not the characters, it's Leatherface, the Sawyer family, and this whole atmosphere surrounding the movie. Leatherface has cemented himself as one of the most iconic horror villains in the genre. You got Freddy Krueger, you got Jason, you got Chucky, you got Ghostface, and then you got Leatherface. They're all on the same tier to me. Like I said before, I enjoy this movie, but I don't fully enjoy the experience of watching it. So that's why, I'm going to be honest with you, I don't really rewatch it around the Halloween time, but I know a lot of people do. It is obviously super influential in the genre. It just doesn't have a lot of fun for me. And for me to be able to rewatch a movie, it has to have a little bit of that in there for me to kind of want to come back and experience everything all again. And that's just my personal opinion. I'm going to give the movie 3 out of 5 stars. Thank you guys again for watching, and I'll catch you in the next episode of 31 Days of Horror.